Welcome back. You're watching Face the Nation. We've been suffering a few technical glitches today. We apologize to our viewers for that, but let's get right back into the discussion. Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah, the first question that was posed to you was, we were right here in the same place that we are right now, back in March, discussing the anti-terrorism bill, anti-terrorism bill number 1 that was presented back then. Today we are here back again on this roundtable discussing anti-terrorism bill number 2. Is there a difference between these two? Because the initial one was withdrawn because of the massive public outcry, civil society outcry against that bill. Has anything changed in the new bill that has come out?
Shalan, there are changes, but what are those changes? So the original bill was completely unpalatable. Anyone who reads it had an objection to it. There were some very serious, egregious provisions that needed to be that needed to be removed. They have taken that to some extent. But does this make this anti-terrorism bill acceptable? I don't think so. So I feel this is what we have seen in the last few months is a very effective sort of PR strategy on the part of the government to somehow sell this bill in some way and to get it passed without having the trouble of having to get a 2/3 in Parliament, right? So, but then we need to go into the broader issue of whether we need a bill or not, and that I am a person who suffered from terrorism laws. And any anti-terrorism bill does give me anxiety, right? And it should give anxiety to I think to any citizen, because we have 40 years of abuse of terror laws. Not only in terms of it being used for people who it should not be used for, that it has not been used in places where it ought to be used also. So that kind of abuse of the law has been a problem. If you ask me, has it changed? Well, yes, we do see certain cosmetic changes, we do see certain changes, but the problem has not gone away. The problem of detention orders, confidential reports, and the fact that we have a very widespread definition of terrorism, etc., all those issues are still there. So yes, we did raise a lot of issues in these talk shows, and we have made some progress. But how much? And is it good enough? And the danger here is that a lot of people could look at this and see that, yeah, it's a sheep, but actually it's a wolf in sheep's clothing.
So also moving on to Dr. Jehan Pereira, what is your take? Is there really a difference? Because the initial bill was withdrawn for a reason. The people didn't like the provisions in it, and I think Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah said certain changes have been made. Do you think this makes this bill any better?
No, I don't think so, because the main flaws in it remain. The main flaw is that the definition of terrorism is extremely wide, not specific. So anything can be construed to be terrorism. Trade union action, protests, all that can come under terrorism. And then the fact that people can be arrested and incarcerated. Now there is a possibility. One improvement is that if you are taken into custody, a magistrate can release you. But if a detention order is signed against you, the magistrate is helpless, can't. The detention order signed by I think the Defense Secretary, if he signs it, then you're in there. You can't get out. The judges can't do anything, even if you have been taken in for some narrow, petty political reason. And we have seen that happen. So those two things, I think, make this unacceptable. The wide definition that it can rope in trade unions, it can rope in protesters against the government, that is not democratic. So I think this is not acceptable.
Shreen, what is your take on this, since you have connections with the general public, you fight for their rights? What do the people really think about it? Are they really concerned about this bill? Do they know about this? What's the mood like?
So people I interact with, particularly in the north and the east, are very terrified of this bill. And in fact, when it was brought in March this year, it was in the north and the east that people first mobilized, because they were the first who suffered at the hand of PTA, and for a prolonged period of time. I mean, I have worked with people who have been incarcerated over 15 years without any charges whatsoever. It has been also used against the Muslim community after the Easter attack. So in that context, the minority community started mobilizing. Thereafter, we also saw some resistance in the south, particularly people who did last Yaragale worked very hard internally, and also we worked with the international community, particularly with the European Union and the GSP plus issues and all. So after that only the government thought about going for consultation, but the consultation that we ask is with the victim community. That never happened, and they brought in with the selective form of consultation, and this particular anti-terror bill right now does, I mean, it has main concerns that we had at the initial stage. Still, it is very problematic.
Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, now, you as part of a civil society organization that has been advocating for change, for more democratic change at the Center for Policy Alternatives, you interact with government agencies, government agents, but at least when we try to reach out for comment, for clarification regarding these matters, it's very, very rare that we get a response from from an authority in the government, someone who can come out and say, look, this is what it was, this is what it is now, we have changed this significantly. There's no one to say that, no one to even talk to us. Even when we invite several on a show like this, they always decline. What has your experience been like in advocating for this and in your interactions with the government?
So Shalin, I think the engagement in a way is very limited. We have been from the outset raising concerns. When the bill was first gazetted, we were very public, very critical in March, and since then, in May, after a lot of criticism, the government asked for recommendations, suggestions, which we engaged with. But that is in a way the only engagement, because what we've seen, the latest version of this, doesn't seem to capture many of the suggestions that we have made. And as other speakers have said, it really hasn't addressed the core issues. The definition, the broad definition, the fact that there is still a lot of power with the executive arm, the whole issue of militarization. And I think one issue that we are very, very concerned is the judicial oversight. There are some provisions, but still limited judicial oversight on this issue. And the bigger question is the role of the executive, the role of the executive president in this. I mean, this bill and several others, I think we can go into it, is what is the role of the executive president and the office. And that's the worrying thing. Now, I think others spoke about detention and the potential abuse, and that's well documented. This law, this proposal, has several other provisions like prescription orders, where the president can issue a prescription order for 1 year. And these are concerns we've raised from the outset, from day one, and we have not got a response. So I don't think that engagement really results in much change. It's more a token effort from the government side.
So we now open the floor for questions, of course, from our journalist present here today, Consultant Director, News First, Niresh Aliyathambi. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Shalan. Hijaz, I'd like to ask you, now, each time we have a serious concern or society has concerns about a law which is coming up, a bill, when we discuss around this round table, the consensus is that there isn't enough consultation. But this goes on. We've seen it happen time and time again, and government is not fixing it. the Ministry of Justice is not fixing this process. That's very clear. What can be done to fix the entire process? Should the Bar Association do something? How is this going to be done? Otherwise, we'll be doing the same thing 10 years from now.
I think, Niresh, the anti-terrorism bill gives us some insight as to what we can do, and I think one is the role played by the media. So if you look at the original bill, it came, I think, towards the nearing a court vacation, coming towards on the 22nd of March 2022-23. So towards the end of March, going towards court vacation, going towards the New Year holidays, the bill was published, and there was a lot of talk that it'll be rammed through Parliament, and that bill will be passed somehow. But there was widespread protest, and not in the terms of protest in the sense people protesting on the road, in the sense that people are talking about it. So there was widespread discussion on the part of the general public and in the media. So that's a very positive development, and also of course the institutions such as the Bar Association wrote about it. For the future, I think I frankly have no sort of clear idea as to what needs to be done, but I think it has to be on a case-by-case basis, and I think the government needs to be committed towards its legislative program, and also in achieving consensus in its legislative program. And so we have experiences in other countries, such as they publish white papers. The white paper is widely discussed. It's taken, the issue is brought down to the grassroots. People talk about it, and then from there upwards you bring up those provisions and discuss those issues. Now that should have happened here, not just for this, but for anything. And also we have the Law Commission. What's the Law Commission's position on the terror laws? Right? What is the law? Has the Law Commission discussed this? Has the Law Commission brought out its own draft? So this is how you build consensus. But as you see in this bill, and also even in the previous example, the Rehabilitation Bureau bill, and also what we have in the Online Safety bill, who knew about any of these bills until they were gazetted? So I think democratic societies have framework for this kind of consultative processes. One is the Law Commission, one is publishing these bills, white papers, and having discussions. None of that is happening. So if we are to do that, then certainly we are moving forward.
Now, Bhavani, let me ask you, the language in this bill, and I've been through it from cover to cover, as we always do on this show. The language it seems to be extremely vague, and one could interpret a lot of these sections in any way possible. Let me just give you an example. Section 24, which deals with the arrest of female suspects, and it says every possible measure shall be taken to ensure that the arrest of a female suspect is carried out by a female arresting officer. Now, every possible measure is very subjective, because the police or the army or whoever can simply turn around and say, we didn't have any female officers, or it was 1 o'clock in the night and all our female officers had gone home. So this is extremely subjective, isn't it? There's nothing concrete there. So you might find that these loopholes are used by unscrupulous officers to the detriment of the public.
Yes, Niresh. I mean, I think if you look at the whole bill, as you said, there's a lot of areas where it's very broadly defined, or the language is very vague. And this is something we've raised before as well. But this is, I think you can't just look at the ATA alone. The point I made before also is that if you look at some of the laws or the proposed legislation that have come about in the recent past, if you look at the definitions, they're so vague. And sometimes when we go to the Supreme Court and challenge, I mean, he just this point about the Rehabilitation Authority Bill, when it came out last year in September, the definition was very, very broad. We challenged it in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held with us and said it has to be very clear and precise. Now, if you have any laws that are going to be used for a particular purpose, but largely in a very repressive manner, you have to have very, I mean, counter-terror law internationally say you have to have precise language. You have to be very clear with definitions. If you look at the ATA, that still there needs to be a lot more improvement made. But I would also go back to the other proposal the government has come about. Both were gazetted on the same day, 15th of September. The online safety bill, again, I think if you look at the definitions or the language used, there is words like distressing that is being used. What is distressing? Who decides what distressing is? So again, I think broadly with any form of laws, if it's not clear, then it's open to abuse. It's very then up to an individual to decide what that means. What does, for example, the integrity of the country mean, the sovereignty of the country? Who decides on these things? What are the standards used? So I think we need to be very, very clear. So when the government says they've made amendments and come back with a better proposal, the question is who decides what the better proposal is? Who has decided on these amendments, the language?
Now, Shreen, when the ATA, the bill first came out in March, we on this show, I think, Shalan, we had 4 episodes consecutively, which I don't think we've ever done before, but we did that, and our voice, we added our voices to the discussion. Now, the thing is, Shreen, now we still see all this vagueness, and some of this is quite absurd. When you look at section 23(1) and 2, the person being arrested may not be even told of the reasons for the arrest if there is no officer who can speak that language. So you could possibly have a lot of abuse there because suspects won't even know what they are being arrested for. What do you think of that area?
See, this is also like a continuum of the PTA. The PTA also the same, when they arrest, they don't even tell them why they are being arrested. Sometimes even the detention order have been issued later after getting arrested. There have been instances where people have been issued detention order post-dating, right? So this is a huge issue that when it comes to minority communities, that if it is not given in their language, they don't know what it is. And I mean, the other thing is also like we have to be very careful in Sri Lanka that we don't have post-enactment review when it comes to laws. So when law comes, when it starts getting applied, we can't fix the system. That's why lawmakers have to be very careful when they word things like this and how it is going to affect the communities. Now, with regard to the PTA, it is the poorest of the poor that gets affected because they don't have the avenue to go to the Supreme Court, right? So there are instances where, very interestingly, innocent people who have been locked up, have somehow filed FR cases because some lawyers volunteer to appear. State Council comes and says, you withdraw the FR case in order for us to dismiss your charges in the magistrate court. Which means even somebody is unfairly locked up, that person can't even prove that person has been innocent. And then the torture and the number of years that they lose, all these things go away. So that's what is very important, that law has to be carefully worded because it affects the poorest, the marginalized minority communities.
Now, when the first draft came out in March, the general consensus over the next 2 months, especially around this table, was that ATA, the initial draft, was worse than the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the PTA. Now that we see the second round of the ATA, would you say that this is still worse than the PTA?
It is. I mean, President can order rehabilitation for thought process. What does it mean? How do you know somebody is radical? How do you judge, right? And then it also something that we in the North and the East have been shouting about is militarization. This particular law has brought in military, officially the military into the process. Air Force, the Navy and the military. Previously they have been doing unofficially. Now officially we have brought in the military. So the law is militarized. So in that context, and also the president, the power that president is going to have, that he is going to lock up everybody, every dissent possible, and going to send them for rehabilitation. I remember when Minister Vijayadasa Rajapaksa was here at your round table, he said, we have released some Muslim young people on bail, they need to be rehabilitated. On what basis? How do you rehabilitate a person for thought process? Is it somebody who said Allahu Akbar need to be rehabilitated in this country? I don't know. We can't bring in this draconian way, this law. It is flawed.
Can I just add in on this? How is it worse than the PTA? Now, of course, the usual arguments will be the PTA, the detention is for 1.5 years. The detention is for 1 year, etc., etc. But when the PTA came in, there were, whatever the reason may have been, armed groups in operation in the North and the East. Are there armed groups in operation now? Then who are we bringing this for? That's where it becomes worst.
So, Dr. Jehan, we in Sri Lanka, over the last 40, 50 years, we have had so much social unrest. The 71 insurgency, the Northeast War, then the 89, 90, examples are many. Has the government of Sri Lanka learned anything at all about society? And I ask you this, not asking about this government or that government, but in general, Parliament and the government, about governance.
I think they are better aware. And I say this because I know the people are better aware. And it is the people who elect these rulers. And I know that the people are better aware because I go and meet the people, I talk to the people. And the people know that the two big issues in our country, at the root of the debacle we are suffering, are two matters. One is accountability. Accountability is about responsibility, and it is about being punished when you do the wrong thing. People know that is something that needs to happen in our country, and that's why the Aragale took place. And secondly, the second thing that our people know is about inclusion, that people should be included in decisions that are being made. It is because there is no inclusion that our pension funds are being mercilessly taxed, because there is no representation there. It is because there was no inclusion that our Tamil youth took to arms. It is because there was no inclusion that 2 JVP insurrections took place. People know that. So I'm sure that our leaders also know that. But for them, they want the power. They want to win the next election. They want to stay in power.
So would you then agree that these bills are all about power and staying in power, and they have little to do with society and the needs and requirements of our country?
Yes, this is to silence the people. It is to silence the truth. We cannot, if that law, that social media law comes in, we will not be able to discuss the truth even, because the truth, where it concerns those who rule, those who are powerful, because sometimes even the mainstream media does not want to take them on. The social media can't be controlled. On the social media they can come. I think that's why the government is targeting the social media. And maybe there might be not so much opposition from in Parliament because they don't want the social media to take them on. So, and then the ATA, again, is to silence the protest, is to prevent another Aragalaya. Of course, we don't want another Aragalaya. An Aragalaya will destabilize our country. But that doesn't mean we should continue the same way. The same group of people who brought this country down are still governing this country. President is different, that's true. President is different, but look at the rest of the government. And I have a feeling that, Bhavani was talking about the power of the president under the ATA, the power to ban organizations, the power of the president under the social media law. He's the one who's going to appoint the 5 commissioners. Our society decided many years ago that when it comes to powerful people who make decisions, that they should not be selected by a single person, that it should be selected by a group of people, preferably government and opposition, the Constitutional Council. Even that may not be working as well as it should, but at least it's better than one man making the appointment. Now, probably the reason why our people, our elites are not so concerned is they think it's Ranil Wickremesinghe. Ranil Wickremesinghe is the one who has the power. He is a very mature politician. He has been there for a long time. He understands human rights. He understands the system. And that's true. He's a special leader. However, Ranil Wickremesinghe may not be there all the time. You give the president all these powers, and he may not be here after the next election, for instance. Then who can we trust the next one who comes? We can't. That's why the LLRC.
Can we trust the current president with such a lot of powers, Dr. Jain?
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
I'm just saying that some of us, I'm not saying all of us trust him with all this power, but maybe it is more acceptable when he has it. But we don't know who is going to come next. So we can't, as the Lessons Learned Commission said, that commission which looked at what had gone wrong in our country, comprising some of our best public servants. It said, rule of law, not the rule of men. Now, this law is the rule of men. It's giving it to the rule of law comes under men who are very fallible, whom, as you said, Niresh, power corrupts absolutely.
Hejaz, in democracies, when a government or a ruling party goes down the wrong path, which often happens in many countries, the answer is elections, in which is free and fair, and let the best party win, the one with the best policies, maybe a coalition, whatever. Do you think that it's time for elections in Sri Lanka?
Well, all along we were under the impression that you needed to have a free and fair election, but now I think we need the finances also, right? So this is the kind of issue that we have to deal with now, right? So certainly it is a time for elections, and we really do need elections, but it's a fact that we need elections, and that we might at some point have to face elections, that we also see these laws coming up, and that is a very important issue, as how we are seeing this raft of legislation being rammed through society, which has wide repercussions. I mean, in my view, these are all anti-Aragalaya laws, all targeted at this phenomenon called the people's uprising. All of them are targeted at that. The Rehabilitation Bureau was targeted at that. The Anti-Terrorism Bill is targeted at that. The Online Safety Bill is targeted at that. And speaking about anti-terrorism laws, and I can draw your attention to the Barbados anti-terrorism law. It clearly says this law will not, and I can just read it out to you from my phone. It says serious interference with or serious disruption of an essential service, facility or system, whether public or private, not being an interference or disruption resulting from the lawful advocacy or from protest, dissent or stoppage of work not involving a risk, etc. So the anti-terrorism law comes in securing the rights of the citizens. But here we don't see that. Here we don't see that. Here the law is framed broadly and left at that because it does cover protest. The government cannot insert those clauses which we see in the Barbados laws into this because it does cover protest. That is the idea behind it. And that's what Shereen also said, is that it's post-review, post-enactment review is not available. So we have to wait for all these things to happen for us then to say, okay, I mean, we will know how bad this looks only after it's enacted. So certainly it's time for elections, and I think and certainly not a time for laws of this nature to be brought in, particularly at a time when the government has more or less lost its mandate, and there are serious questions about its mandate being raised.
Now, in this discussion regarding the anti-terrorism bill, there was also another piece of legislation that was highlighted as a cause for concern. It's the online safety bill. Very vague name as well, online safety. It's probably two words that you shouldn't quite use in the same sentence. But Bhavani, could you just give us a breakdown of what this really means? What does this entail to the general public of Sri Lanka?
First of all, Shalin, I think the title needs to be questioned as to what does online safety mean. And if you look at the bill, there are questions as to whether it's actually safety or restrictions or repression that is being.
How about the preamble, Bhavani? Does it do justice by the act?
I don't think anything does justice in this piece of paper. So what it tries to do is provide a framework that is going to control what is said, reported, published on social media. And it's the most alarming thing is that the power to decide, the power to implement this is going to be with a commission of 5 members. 5 members appointed directly by the executive president. Now, when you look at the other commissions that are in existence, that while there are problems in the process, at least it's not one individual deciding who gets appointed. Here it's one individual. There's no constitutional council. So that in itself is a problem. One individual decides the composition, who gets appointed to a very all-powerful commission. It goes to a point we've been discussing in previous shows on the Broadcasting Regulatory Commission, which also, that bill in itself had problems in terms of the entities that it tried to create. But this draft has such, again, the point about very broad terminology as to language in terms of I mean, that's why I said, what is distressing? I mean, what does distressing mean in terms of a piece of information? What is distressing to you could be very different to someone else. But it's the 5 members who decide. And the 5 members have such broad powers to direct, to issue guidelines, and so it really controls freedom of expression. But it also has a minister that can issue regulations. Now, this issuing regulations is again not new. You see that power proposed in the ATA to the president. Here it's to the minister. And what we need to realize is it's not a hypothetical power in terms of issuing regulations. If you look at what happened in 2021, under the PTA, regulations were issued by the then president. And we went to court and challenged it. Some of us challenged it and got a stay order from the Supreme Court. Those regulations were trying to implement a rehabilitation program that was trying to bypass the judiciary. And it was very much driven as to, as some of the international experts who looked at it said, It's a revolving door from detention to rehabilitation. That is also within the military structure with very limited oversights. What does rehabilitation mean? What does reintegration mean? If someone has a critical point of view, you go through that process. Now, all of this means the executive arm has broad powers. And this, the present proposal, the online safety bill, or whatever it's going to be called, is the most latest attempt by the government to restrict freedom of expression, freedom of thought, media freedom, and really have a real cut down and shut down dissent. And that's what it means. But it's all going to be driven by the executive arm. Very limited recourse in terms of pushing back, in terms of checks and balances. But I think we need to look at all of these things in a larger scheme of things, in terms of looking at a whole spate of proposed legislation, but also in terms of things like high security zones. In September last year, this government tried to bring high security zones. This government also tried
Under the State Secret Act.
Official Secrets Act.
Official Secret.
Yeah, Official Secrets Act was used to bring a high security zone, and I believe it was done by the Public Security Minister, who I think is also in Parliament at least came and spoke on behalf of the official secrets of the present bill. So you have particular individuals trying to push legislation, and the question should be, what is it that they're trying to get? What is the intention? What is the objective behind all of this? Who's going to gain? So it's strengthening the executive arm, but it's also entrenching militarization. It's entrenching the security sector apparatus. It's kind of trying to control particular narratives. And then why are they trying to do all of this now? Is it that they see potential protests, criticism coming about leading up to elections? I don't know. I mean, these are possibilities. But this is not new. This has been in the works for several months. And I think in the context of Aragale, where people took to the streets, pushed back, challenge emergency regulations, challenge attempts to impose curfew, people came out. They are trying to stop any of these things happening in the future.
Hijaz, just one question on this so-called online safety bill. It's nothing to do with media, is it? Media is 1 in a million users, perhaps, of social media. It's the general public, it's teenagers, WhatsApp groups, education, schools use them, businesses use them, academic researchers use social media, surgeons use it to save lives, consulting across the globe when they don't have the answers. It's everything. And more than anything, it's the economy. You can't even think of an economy functioning today without the reach of social media. So this has really nothing to do with the media. It has everything to do with society as a whole, and especially Colombo society, because Colombo society is much more wired into social media than the rural areas, perhaps.
You're absolutely right, Niresh. This is not a law that is restricted to the media in the sense of media houses or broadcasters. It is basically your Facebook page, your Twitter account, and what you publish on that. And this law allows for the commission to have what they consider offensive material removed, even without any judicial hearing or oversight. So that's the danger here. So you could be publishing something, and then it will be removed without judicial intervention prior to the removal. And so it's not media. You're right. It's everybody's Facebook page, Twitter account, Instagram, all of that.
But it's not only the removal, it is also the punishment.
Punishment,
You
yes.
can be punished.
Preliminary,
You can
yeah.
be put into jail.
Yes, yes.
For what
They
you
said
what you publish.
Yes.
Imagine what a fearful thing that would be. Because as Bhavani has been repeatedly saying, if it distresses someone, if it distresses those 5 people or one of those 5 people, then I mean we don't
Yes.
know why it's distressing them. We can be
But it's not just
put into trouble.
It's not just the person. You have so many fake accounts. It could be, somebody does a fake Dr.
The
Jihad
boss.
Pereira and says something which is distressing to somebody in power, and you get locked up. And you wouldn't even know what it's all about, and you won't have. Once you're in remand, you're not going to have access to the devices to even figure out what's going on. Am I correct there?
Can I just come in here? I think we need to recognize, now we are all critical of this, I'm just being very upfront. This online safety bill, I think, is a very repressive piece of law. But we also need to recognize there is also abuse on social media that also needs to be dealt with in a responsible manner. So it's a balancing act. So there's some language here like child abuse that one recognizes there has to be safeguards. But the way they're trying to do with not just this, with any other legislation, you put something in that people go, yes, that's important, and then you put a whole spate of other things to restrict other rights, that then it becomes just a bad law. But also remember, successive governments try to bring laws to control speech, social media over the years. It started actually with 2015 under the Yahapalana period and by using an amendment to the penal code, which we challenged, and the government retracted. Then subsequently they tried to bring in a fake news bill, which was discussed in cabinet, I believe. Then they tried to bring other amendments. Now, with all of these things, what we have said, kept saying is, look at the existing legal scheme. You have the penal code. You had problematic provisions in the penal code, but also Computer Crimes Act. You have various other laws that can be used. When you bring in a whole new law with very limited safeguards, which provides broad powers to one entity with very broad language, that's hugely problematic. So coming back to the lawmaking process, you need to find that balance. If you are to protect vulnerable actors, communities, prevent abuse, prevent images from being used for various reasons, pornography, other things, you need to have safeguards. You need to have that balance. Here, it's just completely one-sided. And some of the provisions in this could also be targeting religious, ethnic dimensions. So, if you look at and we're talking about reconciliation here, if you look at what's happening in the country in terms of some of the land appropriation in the north and east, some of the incidents where religious minorities are unable to conduct worship, conduct their festivals, religious beliefs, there's a whole spate of it. If one even talks about it, reports, you could come under this kind of proposed law, because it could be seen as targeting a particular community and creating a problem. That broad language is in here. That's the problem. So it's to find a balance in addressing some of the abuse, but not go to the far end of what this proposal is trying to do.
Now, Hijaz, political parties in many countries have so much access to technology and funds that they are able to get around any of these online laws simply by hiring a firm in Russia, Indonesia. I'm just rolling out countries here, Philippines. You can do that, and you won't even be identified. Even as a party, you won't be identified. You can sow all the hatred, hate speech, everything on, against Sri Lankan society, and nothing really can be done. So the powerful and those in power can get around this law, but the ordinary person who has no such access to such resources and is just merely voicing their opinion online would end up in remand.
Absolutely.
And we have seen this happen in Sri Lanka and in the United States in elections, especially around.
I mean, we don't need to talk about elections. I mean, just look at the ordinary hate that that the Muslim community was subject to. It was not done with somebody living in some place like Russia or wherever, one of those countries you mentioned. It was done in Sri Lanka. The perpetrators were known. There was clear hate speech, but the law did not apply to them, right? And if you have concerns, Bhavani raised serious concerns about child abuse and the pornography and all of that. We do have a law, the Computer Crimes Act of 2007, right? One of the other problems with these kind of laws is its implementations, which is always one-sided. And as you said, Niresh, the powerful, the politically favored will be shielded and protected. The law will not affect them, but it's the ordinary who will face the full brunt of it. The ordinary, the unpopular, and the ones in opposition, the dissenters, they will face the full brunt of it. The powerful and the politically favored will not get it, and the politically flavored also might not see it, but everybody else, and that's the reality of it.
We have ICCPR in Sri Lanka localized in 2007. It is a convention, international convention. We have localized it. Now, if you take it, not a single person who has been provoking anti-Muslim sentiment, even to create pogrom and people died, nobody has been charged, right? But when people go to counter under Section 3, they are charging people who are countering or writing counter narrative, or somebody like Natasha, like a comedian, right? So like the way that even a perfectly written ICCPR, International Convention, is abused in Sri Lanka. So we should not just look at the laws as flawed drafts, but also the structures that we have. We have a criminal justice system that is flawed. We need to fix that. This anti-terror law, online, all these things will give more oxygen to those structures.
So Shreen, what you're saying right now is that even if a perfectly drafted ICCPR, drafted by international experts and implemented in many other countries, the draft is perfect, but the application is extremely flawed. If that's the case for a perfect draft, what kind of consequences would entail an imperfect draft of this nature? With that, we'll move on to the closing arguments of today as we're in the final few minutes of the program. I'd like to start off with Dr. Jehan Pereira, Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka.
Well, I think what our country needs is greater trust between government and people. The government needs to trust the people, and the people need to trust the government. In order to get that, there has to be greater engagement between the two sides, between the people and the government, which has in a way broken down after the Aragalaya. There needs to be greater engagement, and the government is duty bound to vindicate the rights of the people. If we don't get to that point, then we will not have reconciliation in our country.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jehan Pereira, Executive Director of the National Peace Council. We now move our attention to Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives.
So Charlene, we keep having these conversations when all these proposals come about, and I just wonder kind of sometimes whether the powers, we talk about the power, they actually hear us, because it seems like we keep having these come to these shows and raise concerns. And
Very
then-
rarely do they even join us.
Exactly. So maybe in another month we will be talking about another repressive law. So I just wonder, we keep talking and where does it go? But I think one impact is maybe the laws will keep coming and we keep having to fight and scream and push back, is that we need to remember that democracy requires space and the freedom and the liberty for people to question, to critique, to challenge. And one thing the government, any government needs to realize is that as long as people have some kind of power, some kind of freedom, they will keep doing it. So there will be attempts to restrict, to repress, to suppress their rights, but it's important these kind of shows give that space, highlight these issues. Many of us go to court, we challenge, we protest, we write. That needs to happen. So it's very important at this stage when we're going through a form of rebuilding, but there's still challenges, that we remember that at the heart of it is we had a people's movement that unseated a very powerful government and president. And that's because people took power back. And I would say peacefully took it back. There are different narratives, but I will say peacefully showed that elected officials are there to serve the people. They are there as public trustees. You lose that trust, you need to go. And in that, one lesson is, despite all these attempts to bring all these repressive laws, arrest, detain people, shut down memorialization, all of that, we need to keep pushing back. We need to practice our democratic rights and ensure that that democratic space is protected. So one lesson I will say from all of this is that it's going to be a long, long road ahead. We're going to have many more shows like this, and we're going to have these conversations, debates. But it's very important to remember at least the limited successes we've had. In March, we didn't think we would be able to stop that ATA, that version. But now we are having a conversation about frustratingly similar issues, but we also need to recognize that people were able to push back. So it's very important, while all these things keep at it, keep being pushed at us, that we keep pushing back as well. So thank you for having these programs. Keep at it. It's going to be exhausting, but it's also very essential we have these conversations.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives. We now move our attention to Shireen Abdul Sarur, civil activist.
So these national security laws are supposed to protect people at the end of the day, right? It seems like it is the fear of the rulers that is reflected on these laws, the drafts. So in that context, I look at these rushed drafts and laws as something that is anti-democratic. It looks like a foundation for a future dictatorship. It consolidates executive powers, one man's power, and it also keeps people away from accountability. Immunity is built in. In that context, how far these laws will move to protect people is a huge question. And at the same time, it is also used against the minority community. So in that context, if anybody is talking about truth and reconciliation, I don't know whether the government has any political will to do that, because you have to have a conducive environment. These laws will never create that conducive environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shireen Abdul Sarur, civil activist. And finally, we have Attorney at Law, Hijaz Hizbullah.
Thank you, Sharan, for inviting me on the program. And I do echo Bhavani's sentiments that we also must record those little victories. And yes, in March, this law was, the anti-terrorism law was more or less done and dusted. And it seems that it will be passed anyway. I remember my sister. I don't think my sister will mind me saying this, but my sister calling me and saying, "Why are you speaking against it? It's anyway going to be passed, and you will want to get into trouble again." But here we are. So these are victories. But what is also worrying is this legislative program that we are seeing, which is targeted at precisely this kind of democratic space. And that's what's really worrying in these new laws that are coming up. So we are not talking about laws that allow for torture or anything, but here these laws are all targeting democratic space. So post Easter Sunday, we had the national security, protect our motherland argument, paving the way for a Hitler, where people welcoming a Hitler, and then we had a huge economic crisis and everything, and a massive people's uprising that then got rid of that. And now we are back again on sovereignty, national security, protect the motherland kind of arguments being thrown out, and a legislative program that's coming in that's shrinking the democratic space for another people's uprising. Then what are we going to end up with? Next time we are in a deep, in a soup like what we were there in 2020 and 21, where will the democratic space be to get together and to protest against it, or to make those changes, or to exercise our democratic rights? That's the concern. And my final message to everyone who's watching this, just ask yourself the question, do we really need these laws? Do we really need these laws in our country at this point in time? Who is to benefit from these laws? It's the ordinary public or the government in power? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah, for joining us on our program. Thank you very much also to Consultant Director, News First, Niresh Eliathambi, for asking all the right questions. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in to another episode of Face the Nation. Like Bhavani said, we will continue to keep at it, to hold our leaders accountable and to stand on behalf of the people. Take care and God bless.
Our job here